They and the Senate have to get together and agree on a budget, or this government doesn't fund itself and we look ridiculous.
What are the chances that you don't reach consensus and that there's a shutdown?
I think I'm very optimistic that there will not be a shutdown.
Well, that's White House Chief of Staff Bill Daley on Meet the Press yesterday as another potential government shutdown looms about 10 days away here in Washington.
Democrats and Republicans do have until next Friday to close a $50 billion gap in their respective budget proposals. California Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass is Assistant Minority Whip and serves both the Budget and Foreign Affairs committees. She's also one of only 9 freshman House Democrats and is considered one of her party's rising stars. And Congresswoman, it's nice to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You already have a huge debate going on over the budget. The Republicans have passed a resolution with about $61 billion in cuts.
Right.
Democrats have countered with about $6.5 billion. I mean, is there any way to get a deal that doesn't have Democrats having to make a lot more cuts than they already have?
Well, frankly, we have to have a deal, and I think that you have to look at it in perspective, too, because the Democrats already made $41 billion in cuts last year during the lame duck session, and a lot of the economists have said that the extent of the cuts that the Republicans are proposing would actually slow our recovery down. And so I think it's important that we make cuts. I think they should be made with surgical precision, and we have to make cuts in a responsible manner and not make cuts that are really, to me, more about ideology than they are about the economy.
Just so we have our terms straight, I mean, you mentioned the $40 billion that for a budget that never passed, the Democrats were willing to cut $40 billion from that. But let's just take it from where we are right now. The continuing resolution. Republicans cut $61 billion.
Right.
Democrats offered to cut $6.5 billion. I mean, you are that far apart.
Right, but the reason why I talked about last year was because last year was another continuing resolution. So it wasn't the budget that didn't pass. It was a continuing resolution. So those cuts were, are cuts that count.
Well, let's go to some political reality. Both votes are coming up in the Senate this week. Perhaps tomorrow both votes end up happening. Both are likely to go down. What does that tell you? You're going to have to go on the Budget Committee. It's obviously run by Paul Ryan. It's going to come back to you. If both fail, doesn't that say to you, you got to find more money?
Oh, right. Well, I definitely think we have to look for ways to cut. I just think cuts should be responsible. Let me give you an example. One of the amendments that failed the other day was an amendment that would have cut $100 million to the Defense Department. Now, the Republicans wouldn't vote for that. What was that $100 million going to go for? It was going to go for NASCAR to advertise recruitment to the military. So there are cuts that Democrats are willing to make, but they need to be cuts that are responsible.
Let me ask you this. Do you think you can find $30 billion in cuts the way you're describing?
No, I think the cuts...
You think that there's no way to find another $24 billion as far as you're concerned to get to 30?
The amount of the cuts that the Republicans are calling for is too deep. And the economists have said that if we cut that deeply right now, and we had those presentations before the Budget Committee, if we cut that deeply this fast, it could result in 700,000 jobs lost. And so that's why I think it's important that we cut, but we cut in a responsible manner. And I think if you analyze the cuts that the Republicans were putting forward, they were far more ideological than they were responsible. Why were the cuts so deep to the Environmental Protection Agency? Why were the cuts so deep to health care reform? I think that the Republicans were trying to make a point with their cuts, and it wasn't about being responsible.
Just last week, the White House took a more forceful role in these negotiations, sending the Vice President to the Hill, Jack Lew, Bill Daley. I know you weren't here last year when the White House cut a deal with Republicans over taxes, but there's still a lot of bad blood, I'm sure you know, among House Democrats, feeling that they were kind of sold out by the White House. Do you trust the president's negotiators to get a good deal for Democrats?
Well, I think that there has to be a deal that the Democrats, can agree to, but do I trust the administration? Sure I do trust the administration, that they'll come forward. They also believe that we should cut, but the cut should be made in a responsible manner.
You think the White House got into this a little too late?
Well, I think that they got into it, at an appropriate time. But, we have to wait and see what comes out of that. And so I'll be interested to see what happens this week.
You're a veteran of budget crises.
Unfortunately.
In California, being a member of the Democratic leadership in the state legislature in California. You're now on the Budget Committee here as a freshman. Do you feel like you are getting a fair shake in the minority versus the opportunities you had to cut the budget and things that you had to do in California. When you just compare the processes a little bit.
Well, I have to say that a lot of it is very familiar to me, especially the part that I feel is a lot more about ideology than it actually is about balancing the budget. So that part is very familiar. I think the fact that the Republicans had a process that amendments were allowed was good. I do think that better consideration should have been given to some of the proposals that the Democrats were putting forward, especially the proposals that were calling for cuts. If you're about cuts, then, you know, you need to be about that in an objective manner.
All right, Congresswoman Karen Bass of California, good to have you here on the Daily Rundown.
Thanks for having me on.
All right.
Very much.
Well, coming up next, drastic measures with gas prices soaring. How far will the White